My name is Francesco Pieri. I'm an assistant professor in Politecnico di Milano, where I'm originally from the south of Italy, from the Amalfi Coast. I hold a PhD in data analytics and decision sciences from Politecnico di Milano, and I'm currently working in the data science lab. During my PhD and my postdoc, I spent some time working at the Indiana University Observatory on Social Media and Information Sciences Institute of the University of Southern California. As you may guess, I work in the field of responsible AI, but more broadly, I would say I'm generally interested on about the impact of AI on society from a computer science and computational social science perspective. And I've done some work. I've been particularly active in studying the spread and the impact of online misinformation. And I also do capoeira, which is a Brazilian martial art. All right, so just to give you an idea of the background I come from, back a few years back, I was pretty active in developing computational methods to study the spread of online misinformation from a network science perspective by building methodologies to automatically detect online misinformation by looking at the way information is shared on platforms like Twitter and Facebook. We also studied a lot the role of so-called super spreaders of misinformation, that is, influential accounts that can be very powerful at promoting and amplify misleading stories. And we also try to understand the real-world impact of online misinformation by studying associations between the prevalence and consumption of online misinformation and the COVID-19 vaccination campaign in the US at the state and the county level. And we also studied how platforms were handling content moderation during specifically events of global attention like the Russian invasion of Ukraine. More recently, we've been studying tools like Perspective API, which you may know is a widely used tool for studying online toxicity and online harms. And we found in a paper published last year that this tool is extremely biased towards German language, and we couldn't figure out why. And only recently I became aware that the tool will be ended at the end of the year. So yeah, this problem will not be present anymore. And we also started, analyzing these novel generative AI tools by looking, for instance, at the inherent cooperative behavior of large language models in game theory settings. By studying how these models play the iterated prisoner's dilemma. From a different perspective, we also tackled this. Let's say we try to understand whether models that are non-Western based, in this case Chinese-based models, tend to produce more or less harmful output and tend to express and amplify stereotypes and social biases. And from a kind of a different perspective, we pretty active at studying online conspiracy theories, and we recently found that it is possible to predict future engagement of online users with conspiracy communities ahead of time, even years in advance, by looking at their psycholinguistic fingerprints. So this is just to give you an idea of my more recent research. What I will do now is to set a bit the context in which the research context I kind of navigate in, and then I will throw you some results from our ongoing work, but I will also talk a lot about some other people working, which tend to be more excited about, as it is often the case for us academics, right? And I will try to, after setting up the context, I will talk about two broader research directions that I'm very interested in, and I'll try to pick up your brains a bit more later in the Q&A question, in a new Q&A session. Now, just to mention the problem of online misinformation from a computer science perspective, back in the days we kind of had some terminology crisis where different researchers were using different words to refer to the same problem or different problems at once. But recently, and luckily, I would say, there is consensus about these two broad terms, misinformation and disinformation, which are both about false content, with the difference being, that misinformation is usually shared unintentionally, whereas disinformation is more fabricated. But over the years, we've seen a lot of research papers, tackling some kind of different subsets of these two broader information disorders. And you might remember, the signs of fake news rising after the 2016 elections. Now, of course, and I will, sorry about that, I will probably use misinformation as a shorthand to refer in general to, potentially harmful, misleading and dangerous online misinformation. And when we think about these information disorders, we of course think about the role of social media, because we know that despite their content moderation policies, they oftentimes fail at controlling the quality of content that is shared, that is created and shared online. Research has shown that there are a few influential accounts that might be particularly prominent, at amplifying this kind of dangerous narratives. And other research has shown that the presence of close-knit communities of hyper-partisans individuals that tend to be insulated from contrary perspectives can make this problem worse. And of course, the presence of fake accounts, trolls, and social bots has been shown to kind of contribute to the issue. And last but not least, the presence of very human cognitive biases make us all vulnerable into falling into misinformation. Now, more recently, there have been a few other concerns for us academics, but for general society. When it comes to study these problems, we've seen how social media platforms have been increasingly cutting access to their data, but hopefully the recent introduction, although it's been a few years now already, the recent introduction of the Digital Services Act holds promises for at least for us researchers to get back access to relevant data for studying this kind of problems. And we recently put together a small opinion article that will be published in Communications of the ACM with some colleagues that have been engaging with the European Commission in terms of pilot studies, roundtables with platforms, where we try to draw some opportunities and challenges of the DSA, in particular the Article 40, which will allow researchers to access data. And here I put a reference if you want to check out the preprint version. And simultaneously, platforms have been putting less and less effort in content moderation. And it made the news with X platform first, and then with Meta platforms, which got rid of the fact-checking programs in the US. We don't know how this will work out in Europe yet. And this, of course, was seen in combination with the rise of new but now old generative AI technologies that was used to produce, let's say, less harmful content, to more recently, making the news for a kind of dangerous usage of chatbots at scale, such as, the case of Grok AI on X. And at least for many of my colleagues working on this in the United States, there have been also a few political threats from specific political groups. And I recently found out about this report released by the House Judiciary Committee, where European Union is accused of putting together a decade-long censorship campaign ever since the introduction of tools like the Code of Conduct on countering illegal hate speech online. So just to give you an idea of different points of view around the world. Now, just opening a parenthesis about the DSA. So what matters, at least for researchers like me, is that there are rules that are enforced for very large online platforms, which is pretty much all the platforms I'm interested to research about, in order to mitigate four specific so-called systemic risks. And this allows researchers to access data. And recently, there was a study published by some colleagues, still a preprint here, by some colleagues at the Oxford Internet Institute, that shows how different countries have very different support in terms of content moderation, despite the introduction of the Digital Services Act, and there seems to be an uneven coverage in terms of content moderation across different European countries, and of course languages, with languages as English, as it might be obvious, being much more supported. Now, going back to the case of generative AI and the risks and threats that are around. So everybody was, of course, expecting these waves of sophisticated deep fakes, with a few notable cases of such deep fakes being weaponized by specific political figures. But mostly what the average user is experiencing these days is so-called AI slop, right? So very cheap fakes that can be harmless, but many researchers argued that they should not be underlooked, right? And from a purely, let's say, academic perspective, fabricated content is particularly worrisome, especially in recent times. So we went from this paper from 2024, where these researchers found that you could simply put together a Google Scholar fictitious profile by generating fake articles with generative AI, posting them on preprints, and starting accumulating real citations, to more recent cases of researchers hiding prompts in order to anticipate AI reviews from reviewers in leading conferences, and also the issue of having fabricated reference in many submissions to most not to the flagship conferences such as iClear or ACL. And of course, the main issue with large language models and all the technology that is based on these models is how these models struggle with factuality from a number of different perspectives. And I will mention here a nice paper, kind of a slightly related perspective, but still interesting, I would say, that came out just a few weeks ago, where researchers find that basically you can steer a language model towards misaligned and harmful behavior by fine-tuning it only on a handful of examples of, for instance, insecure code or bad medical advice that would basically spill over to a broader misaligned behavior in the model. And just to give you an idea of how weak are still safeguards that are put in place by different model developers. And from a different perspective, there is a lot of fear that comes from the more and more persuasive capabilities of chatbots, with a lot of research showing how these chatbots can be much more persuasive than humans. And there was a paper published, I think, later last year on Science, where this group of researchers shows that, of course, larger models tend to be much more persuasive than smaller models, but they also find that this comes with diminishing returns, and that you can even fine-tune a smaller model with as many as 1 billion parameters to be as effective as frontier state-of-the-art large language models. And on a brighter side, you of course will have heard of this study from I think end of 2024, or always published on Science, where researchers find that from let's say from the other perspective, you can convince people out of conspiracy theories by letting them engage with in conversation with chatbots. And I believe they also have a more recent follow-up paper where they basically convince people into conspiracy theories. And I don't know how they handle the IRB in that case, but still another interesting point if you like the idea. We took a sub the problem of conspiracy theories specifically from let's say a more measurement perspective, by trying to first estimate a lower bound on the prevalence of conspiracy videos on a platform like TikTok using a semi-supervised approach. And then we tested and evaluated a number of different language models, including a video-based model, to understand whether this technology can be used to detect and mitigate the problem of conspiracy theories, and compare these models to a fine-tuned baseline Roberta model. And we observed that there is a clear trade-off in performance between bigger models and the baseline, but that we also see that these models do not clearly outperform a more traditional, let's say, older model like Roberta. And then last but not least, you might have seen this recent paper published on Science, where a number of researchers raise an alarm on how swarms of AI agents can be in principle put in place and released and threaten the democratic processes. And of course, there was some hype around a platform named Maltbook, where it was shown that you had this social network of AI agents interacting with each other. Many started to talk about this in terms of whether we had reached already artificial general intelligence. Some research has come out already showing that this social network is very far from realistic conversations, with most conversations be very shallow and consisting of single messages and a lot of duplicated messages shared by these AI agents. And actually, this is not the first of such social networks, because there was another social network populated only by AI agents called Chirper AI. And there was a paper published a couple of years ago where researchers showed that there was already some kind of human-like behavior in terms of homophily when these agents were interacting with each other. And going back to the problem of online disinformation, a paper published last year showed that most models can actually be used to generate disinformation on a number of different topics, including frontier commercial models. So this, again, to add to the fact that existing safeguards are clearly not enough to prevent this kind of issues. And last but not least, I will mention the news put out by Anthropic when they released the first reported AI cyber campaign, where at least the first that was reported, right? So we don't know how many others are happening or happened already. And they show that Claude was being used to power this cyber campaign. And this, I think, was the first real-world example, let's say, of alarm of evidence of such swarms of AI agents. So the problem, let's say, it's real and it's there. And we know that the general public is very interested about this, and the World Economic Forum for 3 years in a row has highlighted misinformation and disinformation driven by AI as the top short-term global risks. And what I'm interested in is in whether we can kind of anticipate this kind of risks by simulating the behavior of AI agents in online platforms, right? But before that, we need to answer to the question of whether we can actually simulate digital human behavior in general with large language models. And we know that LLMs have enough information encoded during the training and in the training data to simulate, for instance, responses to surveys, with the milestone paper published by Lisa Argyle, or Argyle, I don't know pronunciation, back in 2023, and the work done by Park and colleagues in simulating, the Sims-like village of AI agents, and predicting the responses to surveys of real-world individuals by prompting models on transcribed interviews of such individuals. So there is evidence showing that indeed LLMs can predict and simulate human behavior, but at the same time there is other evidence arguing for the contrary. So I picked here just one of the many papers published on PNAS last year, where researchers show that in the context of a game as simple as the 1120 money request, models behave very, very differently from human participants. And there is another work that is still a preprint published later last year, where this group of researchers introduces what they call a computational Turing test. So what they do is to simulate online conversations on a variety of social platforms, and then they first compare, how diverse are these conversations, and then they train a classifier. They basically test whether a classifier can simply tell apart organic versus synthetic conversations, and it seems to be the case. And so they argue that the conversations that arise from AI agents interacting with each other are very different from real-world human interactions. And but some other researchers argue that even if this is the case, humans might not be able to tell the difference anyway. And these other group of researchers, which actually is like 90% of these researchers also authored the previous paper that I mentioned. And here they introduce, uh, in a nice choice of words, a collective Turing test, arguing that people aren't good at detecting synthetic messages posted on social media platforms anyway. So it's still relevant, to simulate this kind of dynamics with AI agents. And more importantly, what is the challenge here is the validation of these simulations anyway. And I put here a reference to a nice review published on Artificial Intelligence Review, where these authors, they outline a few different dimensions that are relevant for validating simulations of human behavior with AI. And we also did some work in this direction by adapting the Y social framework, which is a framework to simulate online conversations, to the specific case of Italy on Twitter during the 2022 Italian election. So we collected a data set of conversations around elections, and we calibrated AI agents based on this data, and we looked at aggregate dynamics like homophily. We found that AI agents were kind of able at replicating in-group interactions, but they failed at reproducing harmful dynamics of online toxicity. And we also looked at opinion dynamics models, and we compared the empirical dynamics with a model like the Fredkin-Jensen, finding that the results really vary a lot. So with our use case, we found that there is a lot of variety across simulations, and it seems to be the case that AI agents have a lot of drawbacks at this stage. But going back to the goal of anticipating AI-driven risk-based simulations, we know that AI agents will become more and more pervasive in online platforms. And it seems to be the case that it's important to study how they will behave, even if they are not human-like, right? And we know that more complexity can be achieved with a variety of approaches like persona-based prompting, or letting AI agents employ tools like search and other techniques, and even fine-tuning AI agents to behave more like online users. So I argue that it's important to understand also how AI agents will interact with organic content, because what we are witnessing is a never-increasing prevalence of automated or semi-automated accounts powered by generative AI, right? Moving to, let's say, the second broad direction that I'm interested in, generative AI is going to play a prominent role in online searches, right? So we know that LLMs are basically replacing traditional search engines, although Google has embedded its own chatbot in Google. And there is a nice position paper published in Sigair last year that outlined some challenges from different stakeholders, from content creators that face mainly the problem of copyright and the leakage of personal information, to end users who will tend to be over reliant on this kind of technologies. But of course, the main challenges are for model providers, which will face many liability issues, but also, the very security and potential collapse of these models as the internet gets filled with more and more generated content. And of course, the rise of AI-based browsers poses new questions for us all. And I haven't seen any research yet about this tool. So if you have, please let me know. And I took a look at the recent literature on the topic of Gen AI search engines, and most studies tend to analyze the quality and diversity of the sources that are provided by chatbots when they respond to user queries. So most studies tend to audit this technology by generating a set of queries and then asking, different models, different search engines to answer these queries, and then they look at the kind of sources. And for instance, this study by Minichi and colleagues compare the results of generated results with the more traditional Google News. They find that there are differences across models on how diverse are the sets of sources that they draw their responses from, and they also studied whether models tend to cite more or less factual sources by using, indexes like the Media Bias Fact Check or NewsGuard indexes, and finally observing, for instance, that GPT-4o Mini was citing more factual sources compared to other models. And other work is also looking at the bias, political bias of these models when it comes to reference specific sources from the two ends of the political spectrum. In this work presented in EMNLP last year, researchers found that models tend to be biased towards left-leaning news, left-leaning in let's say in a US definition, and they experimented with swapping the names of sources, and they found that this bias kind of disappeared. So proving that indeed the bias is tied to the specific name of the sources rather than the content of the articles for the retrieval phase. And researchers also try to propose benchmark that can allow to evaluate the quality of search-based answers. So you may be familiar with the chatbot arena. This year at iClear, it will be presented Search Arena, which is let's say an extension of chatbot arena on the specific task of evaluating responses of chatbots to search-based queries. And like in the chatbot arena case, they use this Bradley-Terry model to rank the responses of models on a variety of different tasks that require search-based, that require searches in order to provide the answers. And among the different results, an interesting finding is that answers with more citations tend to be scored higher by users. And but more generally, what really matters is whether a broader, more general question is whether AI-based search, actually Gen AI-based search, will affect information-seeking behavior, right, compared to more traditional search. And there is a preprint out from last year where researchers they recruit participants and they let them search about some controversial topics, and they ask them to agree or not with specific statements that are true or false, and they see whether the usage of a chatbot-based search or a traditional Google search affects the beliefs of these individuals. And they find, first of all, that of course searching for information makes participants more likely to believe into true information and less likely to believe into false information, but they do not find significant significant differences between the two technologies. But still, there is this is let's say one stab at the problem. I think there are still many other aspects that can be explored. And I will mention here because I think it matters in terms of safety and responsible, trustworthy AI. This study that shows that chatbots that can search online can even infer demographics of real-world individuals by searching for their social media accounts. And what they did was to experiment with the synthetic and real accounts of individuals from a previous study where they recruited participants, and they show that models like GPT-4 or GPT-03 is able to accurately infer categories like the age group or gender based only, first of all, based on public information that the model is able to retrieve, right? But also from specifically from social media data. And last but not least, there is now this idea of shift from search engine optimization to generative engine optimization. From a safety perspective, what's important to me is whether results can be manipulated when users resort to generative AI for their searches. I will mention here a paper appearing in iClear last year where researchers experiment with, let's say, controlled experiment with some websites. They try to manipulate the answers provided by some models in terms of recommendation of products. And the interesting thing that they highlight is that what happens, what they speculate is that there will be a prisoner's dilemma among product owners, where each actor will try to manipulate an AI search engine based on its own websites, right? We also looked at generative AI search engines from a Chinese perspective. So we put together a data set of real-world user queries made on Sogo, which is a Chinese search engine, and we try to understand whether answers based on these AI technologies can expose more or less users to potentially inaccurate information. And we compared the models in zero-shot fashion with the AI overview of search engines like Baidu and LLMs with search, and we found that the accuracy of this system was of these systems was very low. And the interesting thing, in my opinion, that we tried to do was to tie this phenomenon to a potentially real-world impact by using the Baidu index, which is the counterpart of Google Trends, right? So we try to estimate whether there was heterogeneity in the potential exposure to misinformation in China based on real-world search queries. I conclude with the last two slides on another ongoing work related to information-seeking behavior, but from a multimodal perspective. So there is less, let's say, less safety here, but still a kind of interesting study, I believe, where we basically try to we recruit participants and we ask them questions based on the content of short and long videos. So we craft some questions based on the content of these videos, and we let them use AI. Actually, the control group does not have access to AI, while the treatment group has access to AI. And in a subgroup, we also let AI being specifically misleading. So we prompt the model to provide wrong answers. This is an ongoing work and still don't have any result. But the idea is to understand how users interact with video content online, and whether AI can assist users in terms of accessing information embedded in these videos. Last slide with some takeaway messages. So we still don't know. Actually, there is still a lot of misinformation about the capabilities and the potential dangers of LLMs, and LLMs themselves can contribute to this problem. We know that online searches will be more and more AI-based, and it will be hard for researchers to monitor them because they happen behind closed sources, right? And we know that fact checking hasn't been solved by AI yet, but for instance, AI can be used to fight the problem of conspiracy theories from a number of perspectives. And last but not least, there are a lot of open questions about the behavior of AI agents at scale. And with that, I'll thank you for your attention.